I'm not a game developer, but I'm trying to learn the skills to be one. To do so, I've been working through this 20 games challenge, recreating old games of gradually increasing complexity. Instead of just making one game per set, I've been making them all, and I've made sure to achieve all the stretch goals. Previously, I've completed games 1, 2, and 3, and so it was time to move on to the first, Game 4. But there was something I wanted to take care of first. I figured the project was lacking a somewhat significant feature, an options menu. It was a bit more straightforward to implement than I expected. Audio buses aren't too complicated insofar as I needed to deal with them, so setting up volume sliders was just a matter of making sure all audio was routed to either the music or sound effect bus, and using sliders to set the volume of the buses. Rebindable controls weren't too tricky either. Just save a dictionary of controls, let the user change the buttons by selecting what they want to change and pressing a button, save the new values to the dictionary, and replace the old input map actions with a newly constructed set from said dictionary. A bit cumbersome to try explaining briefly, but nothing too crazy nonetheless. From there, just had to make it so the volume and control settings were saved, using the same function and file as high scores, and poof! This project now has a working options menu. I even tried learning the basics of how themes work, making it hopefully look better than it would if I hadn't. I also tried making a song for the menu, so you can actually tell the volume slider works. I should probably learn how to make good music at some point. Anyway, enough rambling about a basic menu. It's time to move on to the thing you're really here to see. The first Game 4 of the project, an Asteroids clone. Like with Flappy Bird, I've actually made an Asteroids clone before. It was for a game making class in my early high school days. Like my other attempts at learning game dev, it went nowhere. But hey, if I could make something functional then, I should hope I can make something halfway decent now. The first thing I wanted to work on was the screen wrap. I wasn't content doing it the simple way, just teleporting things from one side of the screen to the other. I wanted to do it the cool way, where you can see things poking through from the other side of the screen. This would be preferred not just because it looks better, but also because it avoids problems with things teleporting directly onto the player. However, doing it this fancy way raises a few issues of its own. For starters, how to make it happen. There's a few ways to do it. One way would involve taking the thing you want to wrap around the screen, and giving it a copy of its sprite and collision placed exactly a screen width away. As the thing starts going off the side of the screen, you can see the copy on the other side. You'll need a copy for the other 7 octilinear directions as well. Yes, that's a word. Yes, I did have to look it up. If applied to the player, every bullet, every asteroid, etc., I imagine that could get confusing to work with, and potentially maybe be a performance issue. Not that performance really matters for a game like this, especially since I put no limit on the number of asteroids anyway, but I suppose it's still something to pretend to consider. Suppose instead of multiple sprites, we had multiple cameras looking at the sprite. One could show what would effectively be the main play area, whilst others could see anything that goes beyond the main camera's boundary, and display that on the opposite side of the screen. Apparently cameras themselves don't quite work like that. Instead, it's a matter of using sub-viewports. After figuring out just enough of how they work to utilize them, I decided that would be the approach I would go with. This would have many consequences later, but for now, time to move on. The first piece of actual gameplay I made was the player's ship. Looked up a palette to use instead of just winging it for the sprite like I previously have, and I think that was a wise move. I decided to implement movement a bit differently than it's supposed to work. Traditionally, rotation would not affect what direction you move, just what direction you accelerate in. I, however, chose to have the player's speed always apply to the direction it's facing, just because I wanted to see how that would work out. It honestly doesn't feel that great, but I stuck with it anyway. Implemented bullets for the player to shoot, and then it was on to the asteroids. I should probably address the fact that they clearly aren't the space rocks you might expect. I reused the sprite from a game jam I participated in, partly because it was simpler than making a new sprite, and partly because it would be an interesting alternative to actual asteroids. Games often include slime-like enemies that split into smaller enemies when damaged, so I figured it still made sense. Made the alien things move and split apart and whatnot, and then it was time to solve a few screen wrap related issues. Firstly, how should they spawn in? Can't really just have them float in from off-screen, because there is no off-screen. While I have an idea how I could work around that, I figured having them spawn on-screen would be fine enough. If aliens could spawn anywhere, though, it's likely they'd just spawn on the player every so often, which would not be fun. I implemented 2 ways of avoiding that. First, I made a little warning indication so the player could avoid them. That alone wouldn't suffice, however. If the player reaches a point where enough aliens spawn, it would be possible that they could cover the whole screen. The solution to that was to have a portion of the screen where the aliens don't spawn. I could go further and make it so the player's ship's position is reset at the start of each wave, eliminating the need for the spawn warning, but I figured that'd be a bit jarring. Another screen wrapping alien issue? Collision. While my sub-viewport solution shows things on the other side of the screen, the collider doesn't actually exist over there, since the thing being screen wrapped is still over there. My solution to this was to effectively implement part of the other screen wrap idea I mentioned earlier, give the player and their bullets additional colliders, and now they can interact across the edge of the screen. With things working smoothly enough, it was time to turn it into a game. I was tempted to have the aliens spawn in gradually instead of in waves. However, that would require figuring out at what pace to spawn in the aliens, and I didn't really feel like taking the time to find the perfect balance between making sure there's enough aliens to keep the player busy, and making sure there's not so many aliens that the player has no hope of keeping up. As such, waves were the way to go. Make the aliens give the player points, implement lives and game overs, add UI and pausing, and it's almost ready at this point. And it was at this point I encountered a rather surprising bug. Since I added the ability to return to the main menu from the game, I tested it, and happened to take a look at the options menu after doing so. When I went to mess with the volume sliders, the game would just crash. It didn't even throw any errors, it just closed the window and that was it. It would only do this when I launched the project from the Asteroids scene. If I started the project from the main menu or another game, it wouldn't crash. I mentioned before that I added music to the options menu, so you could tell the sliders actually did something. Well, I also added a sound effect to the master and sound effect sliders, so you could tell how that was affected as well. After some testing, I found that playing that sound effect, an audio stream player 2D node, was what triggered the crash. Apparently it's something to do with having sub-viewports use the same world 2D as the main viewport. Unfortunately, all I could do was work around this by refactoring Asteroids such that the main camera, and all the game stuff, was in its own sub-viewport, and have the screen wrap sub-viewports copy that world 2D instead of the main one. It fixed the issue, but drastically affected the graphics, causing sprites to not scale how they otherwise would. I tried to fix that, but despite my best efforts, I couldn't. It's not that big a deal, but it certainly wasn't ideal either. Regardless, after adding sound and particle effects, the core of the game was done, and all that was left were the stretch goals. First, power-ups. Made a few variations of a sprite using that same palette from earlier, made the smallest aliens have a chance of spawning power-ups, made them shift around with similar code to the screen shake of previous games, and then to make them do stuff. Because the screen can get kind of flooded with aliens, I gave the player a health bar to compensate for the wonky controls. As such, I figured a green power-up to restore health would be a decent idea. A power-up that damages all aliens on screen was another thought. I felt as though I needed a third power-up, but I didn't feel like doing anything too crazy, so the last one just gives bonus points. Next, a flying saucer. In order to keep it from being too accurate with its shots, I made it aim directly at the player. I figure you're likely to move around too much for it to hit you, and if you aren't moving, this would be decent encouragement. That does, however, make it tricky to shoot at the flying saucer, since you move in the direction you aim, but you can do something the saucer does not: aim across the screen wrap. Lastly, a hyperspace warp. I had to add another button to the controls, which required adjusting the options menu slightly, but other than that, it's just a matter of setting the player's position to something random, and adding a timer for the ability's cooldown. Not much to it, really. With that, the game was complete. Up next is Space War! And it's hard to say how that's going to go. On one hand, I think I can copy over a decent chunk of code from Asteroids. On the other hand, there's going to be a lot of challenges to deal with. Most notably would be the fact that it should be multiplayer, despite me not setting up the project to accommodate multiplayer. But even just setting up a computer opponent will be tricky, in regards to figuring out the opponent's AI. I'll have to change the controls too, in part because the controls I implemented for Asteroids just aren't that great, and partly because of the whole gravity thing. Either way, I'm looking forward to seeing what I can do. Till next time. By the way, I have a feeling that a fair chunk of you viewers are, like myself, going through the early stages of learning game development. If that applies to you, say something in the comments so we can all check out each other's channels or itch pages or whatever, and maybe help each other out. Also, smile.